Fields of survival. In the soft light of a medieval dawn, the fields stretched endlessly, dew glistening across narrow strips of earth carved into long, uneven ridges. Here survival was measured not in gold or power, but in bushels of grain coaxed from stubborn soil. For the medieval peasant, daily life was an act of endurance, hands blistered on wooden ploughs, backs bent beneath the weight of harvest, and every heartbeat tethered to the land. Unlike kings and lords who dwelled in stone halls, peasants lived in wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, where smoke from the hearth blackened the rafters and the scent of damp straw lingered year-round. Historians tell us that in much of Europe by the 13th century, the open field system defined agricultural life. Vast tracts of land were divided into strips, each family tending scattered plots allocated by custom, not choice. The system forced cooperation. Neighbours worked side by side, aligning their sowing and harvesting, for one farmer's negligence could doom another's crop. To plough those strips, oxen were yoked in heavy wooden harnesses, trudging through clay, while peasants sang rhythmic chants to pace their weary animals. Scholars still debate whether this communal system truly bound peasants in harmony, or whether resentments simmered beneath the soil, unrecorded by literate clerics who favoured order in their chronicles. Beyond the fields, survival extended into the margins. Women gathered wild herbs, nettles, sorrel, and chickweed to stretch meagre stews, while children combed hedgerows for berries or trapped rabbits with crude snares. It was a precarious balance. One good harvest could see a family through the winter. One bad season might mean hunger, debt, or worse. A quirky detail emerges from manorial records in England. Some peasants were fined for collecting too much deadwood from the Lord's forest. To U.S. Gathering fallen branches seems harmless, yet in a world where fire was life, every twig mattered, and even warmth was tightly controlled by feudal authority. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant ploughing and sowing barley, oats or rye, while summer demanded long hours weeding under relentless sun. Autumn brought harvest, the most critical time of all, when entire villages laboured from dawn to dusk to bring in grain before storms ruined it. Winter, though a season of relative rest from the fields, was far from easy. Families huddled around smoky hearths, patching tools, spinning wool, and praying that dwindling stores of bread and ale would last until the next growing season. Even leisure bore the imprint of survival. Village festivals, like May Day dances or harvest feasts, were moments when peasants momentarily tasted abundance. Ale flowed, bread was shared, and music filled the air. These were not merely diversions, but vital breaths of joy in lives otherwise hemmed by obligation. It is telling that even the church calendar wove agricultural rhythms into holy days, turning survival itself into a kind of sacred ritual. And yet, fragility loomed. A late frost could destroy seedlings. A sick ox could cripple a family's labour. A small cut, festering without medicine, might steal a life. This fragility created resilience. Peasants learned to mend, improvise, and share labour when illness struck. The rhythm of survival was not heroic, but ordinary, measured in small acts of endurance, repeated endlessly across the centuries. As we step into their world, we must remember, the medieval peasant did not dream of wealth or conquest. To live another year, to feed one's children, and to endure the winter, this was the quiet triumph etched into the fields of survival. The shadow of famine. Even in years when the fields yielded well, the spectre of hunger never truly receded. Crops depended on weather as fickle as fortune, and in an age without modern storage or transport, abundance could sour into scarcity within weeks. Across medieval Europe, famine was not a rare catastrophe, but a recurring visitor, stalking villages with relentless patience. The most notorious episode came in the early 14th century. remembered as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Unseasonal rains drenched fields, rotting grain before it ripened, while storms washed away roads and bridges, strangling trade. Chroniclers describe starving families boiling acorns into thin gruel, selling heirlooms for crusts of bread, or in some whispered tales turning to cannibalism, though scholars still debate whether those grisly accounts were exaggerations, moral warnings written by horrified monks, rather than literal truths. What is certain is that across northern Europe, millions died, their weakened bodies succumbing not only to hunger, but to diseases that followed in famine's wake. For peasants, survival in such times meant improvisation. In village records, we find evidence of famine breads made of barley mixed with ground beans, peas, or even bark stripped from trees. These loaves filled bellies, but often caused sickness, a cruel reminder that not all sustenance nourished. Some turned to fishing in streams once ignored, while others grazed livestock in hidden corners of the Lord's forest, risking fines or harsher punishment. Quirky anecdotes tell of villagers driven to eat cats, dogs, and even vermin in their desperation. Yet, despite the indignity, communities endured, teaching themselves that survival was as much about endurance of spirit as of body. The hunger cycles were not uniform. In years of plenty, barns brimmed with hay, granaries with grain, and alehouses with barrels of fresh brew. But medieval storage lacked sophistication. Rats gnawed sacks, damp spoiled flour, and a single lightning strike could burn down a year's reserves. Thus, even in so-called good years, peasants lived with gnawing uncertainty, always aware that fortune's wheel could turn overnight. It was a rhythm of feast and famine, where joy was tinged with fear, and fear tempered by resilience. Interestingly, famine reshaped the bonds of society. Lords, themselves dependent on peasant labour, sometimes reduced rents or distributed grain in gestures that blended mercy with self-interest. But more often, obligations remained fixed. Taxes and tithes did not wither with the harvest. A starving family still owed its portion to both manor and church. This injustice festered quietly, planting seeds of resentment that, in later generations, would bloom into revolt. Festivals and rituals offered peasants psychological bulwarks against hunger's despair. During lean winters, processions wound through villages carrying relics, prayers rising for divine mercy. Some communities turned to older earth-centered traditions, chanting at crossroads, burying bread in fields, or performing charm rituals meant to coax fertility back into the soil. These practices remind us that for medieval people, survival was not merely agricultural, but spiritual, woven from faith, folklore, and desperate hope. What strikes modern observers is how normalized famine became. Chronicles describe it in passing, as though recording the turning of seasons, another poor harvest, another winter of suffering. Hunger, in other words, was not exceptional, but expected, and yet, within that expectation, lay a kind of quiet heroism. Families found ways to ration, neighbours sometimes shared what little they had, and villages clung together, bound by the knowledge that survival was a communal act. Looking back, the shadow of famine reveals itself less as a single disaster and more as a constant undertone, a reminder that medieval life was precarious, lived on the knife edge of subsistence. Every meal carried the weight of uncertainty, every winter the possibility of loss. And yet, through grit, resourcefulness and ritual, peasants endured. The plague arrives. If famine was a familiar shadow, the arrival of plague was a thunderclap. Sudden, devastating, and beyond comprehension. In 1347, whispers reached Europe of a strange sickness spreading westward from the ports of the Black Sea. Within a year, ships carried death into Messina, Genoa, and Marseille. What followed became the Black Death, one of the most catastrophic pandemics in human history. Between 1347 and 1351, it is estimated to have killed up to half the population of Europe. For the peasant, plague was unlike famine. Hunger crept slowly, its grip measured in weeks and months. The plague struck with terrifying speed. A cough, a swelling under the arm or groin, a sudden fever, then, often within days, death. Eyewitnesses described streets littered with bodies, bells tolling constantly, and pits dug hurriedly to swallow entire families. In some villages, the living fled so quickly that fields lay untended, crops rotted, and livestock wandered ownerless. Scholars still debate whether this collapse of agricultural order accelerated social change more than the deaths themselves, for the plague not only thinned populations, but fractured the systems that had bound them. Peasants responded in ways that reflected both desperation and resilience. Some sealed their huts and refused contact with outsiders. Others carried posies of herbs or clutched amulets, believing foul air or miasma was to blame. A quirky record from German towns mentions peasants smearing themselves with onions, vinegar, or even animal fat, convinced these would ward off contagion. Folklore mixed with practical survival. Villagers avoided strangers, burned clothing of the dead, and, unwittingly, sometimes slowed transmission through sheer fear. Yet death brought strange consequences. Entire villages vanished, abandoned after too many succumbed. But elsewhere, survival carried unexpected opportunities. With fewer peasants to work the land, labour became precious. Surviving families could negotiate better rents or demand higher wages. In England, the government even tried to freeze wages with the Statute of Labourers of 1351, a law meant to curb peasants' newfound leverage. But laws written in parchment rarely outweighed hunger in the fields. Many lords, desperate to keep their estates productive, agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable before the plague. The church, which had offered prayers during famine, now faced crisis of its own. Priests died in droves, monasteries emptied, and faith itself seemed shaken. Some peasants clung tighter to rituals, believing the plague was divine punishment. Others turned to fringe movements, like the flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. Scholars still debate whether this erosion of religious authority marked the first cracks in the medieval worldview, planting seeds of skepticism that centuries later would bloom into reformations. In the countryside, however, peasants mostly endured by retreating into community. Survivors banded together to bury the dead, to guard empty homes, and to tend livestock. Songs and stories shifted, weaving the memory of plague into oral tradition. One haunting motif still echoed in children's rhymes centuries later tells of rings of roses and falling down, a cultural scar left by the epidemic's shadow. And yet, despite its horror, the Black Death did not erase the peasantry. Instead, it reshaped them. Those who survived inherited land, tools, and sometimes even freedom from obligations that had been impossible to escape before. The plague was both destroyer and catalyst, a terror that shattered families, but also a strange, grim force that altered the balance between lord and labourer. For the peasants who lived through it, plague was not an abstract historical event. It was the silence of an empty hut at dusk, the sight of a neighbour's ox wandering unclaimed, the fear in a child's eyes when a cough lingered too long. And still, in the midst of devastation, fields would be ploughed again, seeds scattered, bread baked. Life bent under plague's weight, but remarkably, it did not break. Faith and folklore. In a world where invisible forces seemed to govern survival, weather, disease, fate itself, peasants turned to what they knew, faith and folklore. The church loomed large, not merely as a spiritual guide, but as a constant presence in daily life. A village without a church was almost unimaginable, for it was here that the rhythm of the seasons was sanctified, births were blessed, marriages bound, and the dead commended to eternity. The tolling of bells called peasants not only to worship but also to order, binding time itself to the calendar of saints and holy days. When famine gnawed or plague raged, peasants often interpreted their suffering as divine punishment. Priests preached that sin invited calamity, urging confession, penance, and prayer. Across medieval Europe, processions wound through villages carrying relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, objects believed to channel divine mercy. Mainstream chronicles tell us that in 1348, Pope Clement VI even consecrated the Rhone River, declaring that those who died of plague and were cast into its waters would be absolved. Yet faith was never monolithic. Scholars still debate whether ordinary peasants truly internalized church teachings as the clergy presented them, or whether they wove Christianity into older, earth-rooted traditions in ways the church only half controlled. Folklore thrived in those spaces where doctrine did not reach. In the glow of firelight, stories were told of wandering spirits, fairies that blighted crops, or witches who soured milk. Charms against illness were pinned above doorways, sprigs of rue, iron nails, or circles carved into wood. Quirky accounts survive of peasants baking loaves with tiny crosses scratched into the crust, believing it would ward off evil. Others whispered of elf shot, invisible darts from unseen beings that caused livestock to sicken, a belief older than Christendom itself. Superstition was not always separate from faith, but often braided into it. Villagers prayed to saints for rain or healing, but they also performed rituals at wells and groves that bore faint echoes of pre-Christian traditions. To us, these practices may seem contradictory, but for the medieval peasant, they were simply different tools in the same kit of survival. If one prayer failed, perhaps another might work. If a saint did not answer, a charm might. What mattered was not consistency, but hope. The church, for its part, alternated between tolerance and condemnation. Clerics railed against superstition, denouncing charms and divinations as pagan remnants. Yet ironically, some priests themselves blessed fields, rang bells during storms to scatter demons, or prescribed pilgrimages to holy sites as remedies. The line between faith and folklore was blurry, even for those who claimed to police it. In moments of crisis, collective rituals brought solace. During plague years, flagellant groups passed through villages, beating themselves bloody in public displays of repentance. Ordinary peasants sometimes joined them, swept up in the spectacle of suffering made sacred. At other times, villagers gathered for rogation days, walking the boundaries of their fields in prayer, asking for protection from blight. These rituals were not only about divine intervention, they were also about reaffirming community bonds, reminding each member that survival was shared. Faith and folklore gave peasants a framework for making sense of a fragile world. They explained why crops failed, why children died, why storms came. They provided agency, however symbolic, against forces that otherwise seemed unstoppable. And though we might see these beliefs as superstition, they were, in truth, a form of resilience. For peasants, belief itself was a tool of endurance, a way to face tomorrow when yesterday had offered only grief. In their churches, they prayed for salvation. In their homes, they carved charms and whispered spells. Between heaven's grace and earth's mystery, medieval peasants wove a web of meaning that kept despair at bay. It was not perfect, and it did not always save them, but faith and folklore alike gave them the courage to keep ploughing fields, burying their dead, and hoping against all odds that life would continue. The Lord's demands. If famine and plague were enemies sent by nature or God, the feudal lord was a more immediate burden, flesh and blood, armed and unrelenting. Medieval peasants lived within the manorial system, a web of obligations that tied them to land and lord alike. Their huts and fields were rarely their own, they belonged to the manor, and in exchange for the right to work them, peasants paid in labour, goods and coin. The relationship was framed as mutual, protection from above in return for service below, but in practice, the balance leaned heavily toward exploitation. Mainstream records, such as the Domesday Book of 1086, reveal just how meticulously lords tracked their tenants' duties. A peasant family might owe several days of week work, tilling the lord's domain fields rather than their own. They delivered portions of their harvest, grain, eggs or livestock, and surrendered coin taxes at appointed times. They even paid merche, a marriage fee, if a daughter wished to wed outside the manor. To modernise, these obligations read like chains, and indeed, for many, they were. Scholars still debate whether peasants truly accepted feudal bonds as a natural order, or whether simmering discontent was more common than official records, written largely by lords and clerics, admit. The demands stretched beyond the predictable. In times of war, peasants could be called to provide carts or horses. When the Lord's Hall hosted feasts, villagers sometimes owed hens, ale, or bread. A quirky detail from English manorial rolls records peasants fined for brewing ale too strong, the Lord claiming a cut of profits even from their humble attempts at cheer. Nothing escaped taxation. From milling grain at the Lord's mill to baking bread in his oven, peasants were bound to use and pay for services monopolised by their overlord. Yet within this weight of obligation, peasants fell, and ways to resist. Some quietly underreported harvests, hiding sacks of grain in lofts or burying them in barrels underground. Others bartered secretly with neighbours, avoiding official markets. At times, whole communities pushed back. In 1297, for instance, French peasants, known as the Jacquerie, staged uprisings, brutally suppressed but remembered as a warning of what could happen when demands grew unbearable. In England, simmering resentment at taxes, especially the hated poll tax, would eventually boil into the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Still, most resistance was quiet, folded into daily life. A peasant might take longer than required to complete labour, plead illness, or forget an obligation. These small acts of defiance rarely made it into chronicles, but they mattered. They revealed that even within a rigid system, survival required not just submission, but cunning. The lords themselves were not always unyielding tyrants. Their wealth depended on peasant labour, and in times of disaster, plague, famine or war, they sometimes lowered rents or forgave debts to keep villages functioning. But such gestures were rarely altruistic. A depopulated manor meant wasted land and lost income. Protection, too, was double-edged. Lords maintained armed retainers, promising defence against raiders or bandits. Yet those same soldiers could extort, harass, or conscript the very peasants they were meant to shield. What emerges is a portrait of peasants caught in a paradox. They were indispensable, yet treated as expendable. They fed the manor, yet often went hungry. Their labour built the wealth of kings and bishops, yet their own huts leaked rain and smoke, and through it all they endured, navigating obligations with a mix of compliance and quiet resistance. The demands of the Lord were not natural disasters, but they were just as relentless. To survive them required not only hard work, but subtle negotiation, communal solidarity, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. And while the records speak most loudly of what peasants owed, the very survival of villages across centuries is proof that peasants also knew what to keep for themselves, hidden communities. Beneath the weight of obligation and the shadow of disaster, medieval peasants carved out spaces of their own, hidden communities of joy, trust, and resilience. To imagine peasant life only as toil and oppression is to miss its quieter, warmer undercurrents. Even as they bent beneath the Lord's demands, peasants found ways to celebrate, to bond, and to weave networks of mutual aid that often proved as crucial to survival as grain or livestock. Festivals were among the most visible expressions of this communal life. On May Day, villagers decorated poles with ribbons and flowers, dancing in circles long into the night. Harvest festivals transformed work into revelry, as fields once heavy with crops became gathering grounds for song, ale, and storytelling. These moments of festivity were not trivial distractions. They offered release from monotony, reaffirmed bonds between neighbours, and stitched joy into the fabric of endurance. Chroniclers sometimes frowned at the excess, complaining of drunkenness, gambling, or illicit romances, but for peasants, these were acts of life affirmation in a world often coloured by loss. Hidden communities also thrived in smaller gestures. Villagers shared tools, exchanged labour, and watched over each other's children. If one family's ox died, neighbours might lend theirs in turn, for all knew that disaster for one threatened disaster for all. Quirky records show fines levied against peasants who secretly held ale feasts without the Lord's permission, proof that fellowship often spilled beyond official oversight. These clandestine gatherings were not just about drink, they were about solidarity, creating spaces where peasants could speak freely, laugh loudly, and feel human outside the strict hierarchies of manor and church. Storytelling was another vital thread. Around hearthfires, peasants told tales of tricksters, outlaws, eating lords, of clever animals surviving against odds, of mythical beings lurking in forests. These stories were entertainment, yes, but also encoded lessons, resilience, caution, and sometimes subtle critiques of authority. Scholars still debate whether these folk tales were conscious acts of resistance or simply oral traditions shaped by circumstance. What cannot be denied is that they gave peasants a shared language of endurance, a cultural inheritance carried from one generation to the next. Communal rituals often blended sacred and secular. Beating the bounds, for instance, saw villagers walk the borders of their parish, marking boundaries with prayers and songs. It reaffirmed both faith and land knowledge, while quietly reinforcing who belonged to the community. Weddings and funerals, too, became collective events, with whole villages joining in procession, feast, and mourning. In these moments, peasants transcended their individual hardships, affirming that survival was never solitary. Even secrecy could bind them together. Hidden networks of barter thrived outside official markets, exchanging eggs for cloth or milk for bread. These quiet exchanges often bypassed the Lord's dues, small acts of self-preservation that relied on trust. A peasant might whisper of surplus apples to a neighbour, knowing that when their own stores ran low, generosity would be returned. Not all bonds were harmonious. Quarrels over land, gossip, and grudges sometimes split villages. Yet the need for survival meant reconciliation usually followed. After all, a ploughshare could not be repaired without the blacksmith, bread could not be baked without grain, and a harvest could not be gathered without many hands working in concert. To modernize these hidden communities might seem fragile, but in truth, they were the scaffolding that held peasant life together. Lords could demand labour, famine could drain bellies, plague could empty huts, but as long as the bonds of kinship, friendship, and ritual endured, so too did the peasants. Their solidarity was their quiet rebellion, their feasts a defiance of despair, their stories a shield against silence. It is here, in these hidden communities, that we glimpse the humanity of medieval peasants most clearly, not only their suffering, but their laughter, resilience, and hope, shifts of power. For centuries the feudal order seemed immovable, like the stone castles lords built to dominate the landscape. Yet history is rarely as fixed as it appears. By the late Middle Ages, cracks began to spread across this seemingly unshakable system, and peasants, those quiet labourers of the fields, found themselves, almost unexpectedly, at the heart of change. One of the greatest catalysts was the Black Death. As we saw earlier, plague stripped Europe of perhaps half its people, leaving villages half empty and lords desperate for workers. Where once a lord could dictate terms, suddenly labour had leverage. A surviving peasant might demand lower rents, freer movement, or better conditions, and often, lords agreed, for empty fields meant empty coffers. To curb this, authorities imposed laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But parchment decrees could not erase reality. Across Europe, peasants began to recognise their worth, and their quiet negotiations carried the seeds of transformation. Yet negotiations did not always remain quiet. Sometimes desperation and anger boiled into open revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England stands as one of the most famous eruptions. Sparked by repeated poll taxes and fueled by resentment of oppressive lords, tens of thousands of peasants marched under leaders like Wat Tyler, demanding justice. They stormed London, confronting royal officials, and for a brief, startling moment, it seemed the old order might shatter. Chroniclers describe fields empty of labour as villagers poured into the streets, wielding farm tools as weapons. Although the revolt was crushed, Tyler killed, promises broken, it left an indelible mark. Scholars still debate whether the revolt truly shifted policy or merely symbolised a broader tide of change. But what is clear is that peasant S had found their collective voice. Elsewhere, similar movements flickered. The Jacquerie in France in 1358, the German Peasants' War in the 16th century, these uprisings often ended in bloodshed, yet each revealed the simmering tension between obligation and survival. And though the sword often silenced rebellion, the memory of it lingered, haunting the minds of rulers who realised that their authority, however divine in theory, depended in practice on the compliance of those who tilled their land. Even when not in open revolt, peasants reshaped power through subtler means. Migration offered escape from manorial obligations. Villages abandoned after plague created opportunities for squatters to claim land with fewer restrictions. Towns and cities, expanding through trade and craft, beckoned rural folk with promises of wages and freer lives. Lords found themselves competing, not only with death, but with opportunity, as peasants weighed the value of service against the lure of independence. Quirky details from manorial records show how lords tried to adapt, offering bonuses of ale, new boots, or even pigs to attract tenants. Others attempted to bind peasants more tightly, enforcing serfdom with harsher penalties. Yet the tide of history was shifting. Bit by bit, the balance of power edged away from absolute feudal dominance toward a more negotiated, fragile order. The church too felt the pressure. With its authority shaken by plague and corruption, peasants began questioning not only worldly lords but spiritual ones. Movements like the Lollards in England or the Hussites in Bohemia spoke of equality before God, planting ideas that unsettled hierarchies, both sacred and secular. While not all peasants embraced these radical voices, the very existence of such debates reflected a world in motion. These shifts of power did not transform peasant life overnight. Huts still leaked smoke, winters still brought hunger, and obligations still weighed heavily. But the cracks were there. Moments of resistance, of bargaining, of collective action. Survival, once framed as mere endurance, was becoming something more, the slow, uneven assertion of agency. The medieval peasant had not only survived famine, plague, and lords. By the closing chapters of the Middle Ages, they had also begun to bend history itself, subtly reshaping the very systems that had long kept them bound, echoes through time. As the Middle Ages waned and Europe edged toward the dawn of modernity, the lives of peasants left echoes that still ripple through our world. Their survival was not only a matter of endurance, but of shaping the very structures that replaced feudalism. And though the names of individual peasants are largely lost, buried in anonymous churchyards or forgotten in brittle manorial rolls, their collective imprint endures. The decline of serfdom is one of the clearest legacies. By the 15th century, many regions of Western Europe had moved away from rigid feudal obligations. Rents increasingly shifted to money payments rather than labour dues, giving peasants more autonomy. A mainstream fact underscores this. In England, by the early 1500s, villenage, the legal condition of bondage, was in steep decline, replaced by tenant farming. This transition was not the result of royal decree, but the cumulative weight of centuries of survival, bargaining, and subtle resistance. Scholars still debate whether this shift should be credited more to demographic disasters like the Black Death, to economic changes in trade and land use, or to the stubborn agency of peasants themselves. The echoes also reverberated culturally. Folktales, songs, and festivals carried forward the memory of survival. The nursery rhyme "Ring Around the Rosy," however debated in its origins, remains a haunting echo of plague years. Village fairs, once spaces of barter and merriment, evolved into traditions that still mark calendars across Europe. Even the communal rhythm of harvest festivals survives, though stripped now of its desperate stakes. Quirky details remind us that peasant life was never erased, only transformed. In some alpine villages, late medieval charters granted peasants collective rights to graze cattle or harvest timber, rights that continue astonishingly into the present day. In others, ancient boundary-walking rituals, once meant to guard fields from blight, persist as quaint pageants, long divorced from their original purpose, yet stubbornly alive. The echoes can also be heard in the story of power. Revolts like the English Rising of 1381 may have been crushed, yet they lingered in the imaginations of rulers and ruled alike. The idea that peasants could act as a collective force, however briefly, foreshadowed later movements for rights and representation. Historians often draw a long line from medieval peasant resistance to the social upheavals of the early modern world, the Reformation, the English Civil War, even the seeds of democratic thought. The humble peasant, once dismissed as voiceless, had in fact left a resonance that would eventually help shape revolutions. Most poignantly, the echo is human. The fragile huts, the smoky hearths, the long days in fields bent under the weight of hunger and obligation, all these remind us that history is not only made by kings and battles, but by countless ordinary people who endured. They did not leave monuments of marble or libraries of parchment. Their legacy was survival itself, passed silently through generations. And so, when we walk today through Europe's patchwork of fields, many still shaped by medieval ploughing, or when we cross villages whose names stretch back to Domesday, we are moving through the echoes of peasant lives. Their fields have become ours. Their survival has made our present possible. Conclusion. The story of medieval peasants is not one of faceless masses, but of countless small victories. They lived at the mercy of weather, disease, and lords, yet they endured through grit, ritual, and community. In their fields, they bent their backs against famine. In their homes, they prayed, told stories, and carved charms against plague. Beneath obligations, they wove networks of trust and quiet resistance. When pushed too far, they rose in revolt, reminding history that even the lowliest could demand a voice. Their survival was not passive. It reshaped the balance of power, eroded the rigid bonds of feudalism, and laid the groundwork for a more fluid, if still unequal, world. To tell their story is to honour endurance itself, the strength of ordinary people whose anonymous labour and stubborn resilience carried Europe through centuries of crisis. Their echoes remain, whispering that survival too is a kind of triumph.